The AP has new reporting on U.S. allies in the Gulf who are privately urging President Trump to continue and intensify the war against Iran. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain are making the case that the war should not end because Tehran has not been weakened enough, according to U.S. Gulf and Israeli officials. The AP reports that these governments initially complained that they were not given advance notice by the United States and Israel before the conflict started, and that the U.S. ignored their warnings that a war would have devastating consequences for the entire region. But some officials from these countries now view the war as an historic opportunity to cripple Tehran's clerical rule once and for all. President Trump was asked about Gulf allies Sunday night while on board Air Force One.
Do you want to see Gulf countries that are being attacked by Iran to start to fight back?
They are fighting back. Saudi Arabia is fighting back hard. Qatar is fighting back. UAE is fighting back. Kuwait's fighting back. Bahrain's fighting back. They're all fighting back. Actually, they were surprised to be hit. I was very surprised they got hit. And once they got hit, they started fighting very well. We're very strong communications with all of those countries, and they've all been fighting. They're 100% on our side.
Okay. All right. There's some fact-checking to be done there while the Gulf countries host U.S. forces and bases from which the military has launched attacks on Iran. The countries themselves have not joined the offensive strikes.
And they're very careful to actually say that there are no offensive attacks coming from our countries. Jim VandeHei, the president has a couple of different ways to go here. While we're hearing the Wall Street Journal's reporting that he's telling aides that he may go ahead and leave with the straits still closed and controlled by Iran. But others are saying he needs to carry through with it. Strategically, it may be a very bad move to leave an angry, injured, radical regime in place in Iran, even more radicalized by this war, if that was actually even possible. That's on one side, and that's why our Gulf allies are saying you've got to finish this regime off. On the other side, our opening story, and I'm sure the opening story for a lot of people and a lot of media outlets is $4 a gallon gas, which really hits Americans in their pocketbooks at a time they were struggling already on affordability issues. So the question is, which direction does the president go, and what are the political stakes?
Yeah, let's step back for a second. Any viewer watching this has got to be thinking, like, why the hell are we in Iran, and what the hell is the strategy? And the Wall Street Journal reporting is correct. AP is correct. Everything that Barack Rabid has written is correct. The president, when you talk to aides, is about 75 to 85% total improvisation by the moment on this war. And so at any given moment, he is saying different things, and those things are getting transmitted out. They would say, well, that's part of the strategy. We're keeping the enemy confused. The truth is, he's really hacked off internally. He wants to get out of Iran. They thought they were going to be able to go in quick. They were assured they'd be able to go in quick, decapitate the regime, decapitate the ability for Iran to continue to do what it did in the region and get out. And now they can't get out. And just looking at the conversation, listening to this conversation, you hear emphatically why it's going to be really, really, really difficult to get out of here. The Iranians have no reason to compromise right now. They have to end this war with us fearing ever going back into Iran. The Israelis don't want the war to end at all. They want to destroy Iran so it's no longer a threat to them. Now you have all these Gulf allies who were surprised that they got attacked. Nobody should be surprised. We've had $25,000 to $50,000 drones available to almost any nation. Obviously at scale, they can be used for asymmetrical warfare that are now being used in the region that have pulled in 5, 6, 7 additional countries. They now don't want us to leave. And so you have 4, 5, 6 different parties that have an interest here. So just pulling out and grabbing the oil and throwing it in a tanker and running, that doesn't work. It's not logistically possible. It's not diplomatically possible. It's not financially possible.
Yeah, and not possible to find Delcy Rodriguez, who speaks Farsi, to step up and run the country. So this is Jonathan Lemire, I keep hearing people saying that they're shocked, that there's gambling going on in the establishment. We have been wargaming. We've literally been wargaming an attack against Iran since the early days of the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime in 1979. And every one of those war games, every single one of those war games have shown that they could attack the Straits, that they could really screw the West and the rest of the world on holding oil hostage. So when people say they're shocked at that, when people in the administration say they're shocked at that, when Republicans on Capitol Hill say they're shocked at that, then they're just dumb. They're stupid because they haven't been seeing what everybody who's been wargaming this has been saying, whether they're in the military, whether they're in the intel community. That wasn't difficult to figure out. It's the same thing with attacks against regional partners. And I have been hearing since I was young, if we go in and attack Iran, understand the blowback will be extraordinary, not just in the region, but in Europe, in America, all across the world. These are all things we've all been hearing for over 4 decades. So please, if everybody could just stop with I'm so shocked and stunned. I could have never seen this coming. How could anybody believe they would have ever stopped the Straits or attacked the UAE or attacked Saudi Arabia? Of course, they were attacking Saudi Arabia months ago, the UAE months ago. It's just like this should not be a shock to anybody. And quite frankly, they're lying if they say they are shocked.
You used the word I was going to. They'd be lying. The president will be lying. Administration officials would be lying because we know through our reporting, we've talked to ex-military and administration officials from a number of Republican and Democratic administrations alike, on air and off, saying, yes, they knew that Iran would do this. Now, perhaps Iran has been more effective than expected in closing the Strait of Hormuz. Perhaps Iran has hit at its neighbors more forcefully than expected. But this was not a surprise, period. And the fact that the administration is claiming it is them trying to spin because the war is not going as well as they thought. To Jim VandeHeye's point, they did think this could be done in a handful of days, a week or two at most. We're now past the month mark. They are seeing energy prices soar across the globe. Gas, yes, hitting $4 a gallon. There's going to be ripple effects into other fields soon. We're already seeing that. And let's just underscore here. If the U.S. were to, as the Wall Street Journal reports, the president is considering, suddenly abandon this mission and let Iran control the Strait of Hormuz, what a disaster that would be. What would this war have accomplished? Yes, you've degraded some of Iran's military. Well, Iran's military wasn't a threat to the United States to begin with. So instead, though, you've allowed Iran to control the energy markets in a new, outsized way. We'd be leaving in a we'd be leaving in a weaker position than we were going in. And we also would have, and let's be clear, enraged our allies in the Gulf. And President Trump has made a point of trying to befriend some of those Gulf states, trying to have better relations with them. They would be furious if we suddenly were to leave Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz, which they need as well, and also leaving an embittered, angry, hardline regime in place that will continue to lash out at its neighbors and potentially the West.
Well, and I think that's the reason the reporting that the president's very frustrated that this wasn't like Venezuela is why. And I must say, David Ignatius warned daily that the White House, the administration should not look at Iran like Venezuela, that it was not Venezuela. It wasn't going to be one and done. And I will just say, whenever I was asked, whether by people in administration or other people in Washington, whether we should go into Iran, I said, absolutely not. In fact, my exact words were, don't listen to Lindsey Graham. This is not going to be easy. Are they like the head of the axis of terror? Yes. I've been calling Iran the epicenter of terrorism since 1979. But I also have understood, because I've been hearing this for 4 decades, that going into Iran was going to be extraordinarily difficult. And so here we are. And because this is where we are, leaving the region, and actually the United States consumers in a worse place at the end of the war than they were at the beginning of the war if the straits are closed. that's just a lose-lose proposition for everybody. So